Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. And in this programme today, we'll be discussing a TV interview that our Defence Secretary Grant Shapps had on Sunday when he was asked what is the government's position regarding a Palestinian state. He publicly rebuked the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for rejecting outright the creation of a Palestinian state. And so we'll be asking, is it a coincidence after Grant Shapps' interview that 8 hours later we were hit by Storm Isha, which brought about 101-mile-an-hour winds and killed 4 people. So is there a direct consequence when this nation touches the apple of God's eye and we see a kind of disastrous storm emerge? And so we'll be asking, will this nation bless Israel or shall it curse Israel in fulfillment of Genesis 12, chapters 1 to 3? Regan, great that you can join me as always for Behind the Headlines. And I think what's extraordinary is the fact that our Defence Minister Grant Shapps was interviewed by Laura Kinsberg on BBC television on Sunday morning. We can see him there on screen, publicly rebuking Benjamin Netanyahu for his rejection of a Palestinian state. And then we get hit by Storm Isha, literally between 6 and 8 hours later, that's caused absolute devastation to this country. So is God saying something to our nation and to our government in the way that it treats Israel and the Jewish people, and particularly now as well, that Israel is literally fighting an existential threat for its survival, that if Israel doesn't destroy Hamas in Gaza, then the very state of Israel's existence is undermined?
Well, he already has said something very clearly in his word, and you've already alluded to that in the promise and the covenant made with Abraham. God very clearly says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. The panoramic insight of the scriptures that we see throughout indicates that even though the people sin against God, even though the people have rebelled against God and followed false gods throughout the Old Testament, we see that's a big part of the problem, and they face God's judgment as a result. Even so, God still has a forever plan for Israel. His covenant was forever, and that continues, and he reiterates that time and again through the law, the writings, and the prophets. That's still the same in the New Testament. A lot of people say, oh, well, you know, now that we have the New Testament, it's completely different. The church has, the term is replaced even. Or some will say, no, maybe they'll equivocate and say, no, not replaced, but it's extended. We have an extension, which to some degree is true, but it doesn't prioritize or place the church over Israel. Rather, it sees we who are not of ethnic Israel grafted in to this Israel of God, made up of the Jews and those Gentiles who follow Messiah, right? So this is a part of the theological background, but this plays out in a very practical, political, day-to-day way. We see throughout the scriptures, whether it's with the Assyrians, whether it's the Babylonians, the Persians, you can see in history with the Greeks, you can see with the Romans, even following the conquest of Jerusalem, the takeover of Jerusalem in AD 70, the individuals, the battalions that were involved in that all faced complete destruction within a matter of years. And so God, having clearly written in his word, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. You see it play out in the story of Balaam and the pagan king who's trying to buy his curse over Israel. You see it play out time and time again. We say we serve the same God yesterday, today, and forever. Why is that not really viewed as the same by some in this case? So I think we at the very least, need to ask the question, are we incurring God's wrath? And really, what fruit are we bearing for this ongoing attempt to divide the land? And, as we'll be seeing, what's God's take on dividing the land? It's there in Scripture if we have eyes to see and ears to hear.
No, absolutely. And it is important as well because God deals with nations and he judges nations, particularly as they relate to his people Israel. And I found it actually extraordinary. I need to do some investigation into this, but Channel 5 had a program looking at the greatest snowstorms we've had in this country in 1947. And for those viewers who remember the winter of 1947, it was horrific. I believe around near 3 months of snow, brought the whole country to a halt. And you're thinking, well, was there a link between that snowstorm and Israel? And of course, 47 is when we blocked the Holocaust survivors from entering Israel. We prevented the creation of a modern state of Israel. We went back on our promises on the Balfour Declaration, did everything in our power, the British government, under the Labour government at the time, to prevent the establishment of the modern state of Israel in fulfilment with God's plans and purposes. And of course, then we get hit by the biggest snowstorm this nation has ever seen. So it's important that we analyse British foreign policy, that of the EU, and also the United States towards Israel at this time, because there are growing calls now for Israel to end its military operation against Hamas in Gaza, both from the Biden administration, from Antony Blinken, from David Cameron, now Grant Shapps, our Minister of Defence, as well as the EU. Also primarily because we're going into election year. You know, it's elections in this country, relying upon the Muslim vote, the same in the United States, which supporting Israel no longer doesn't go down so well within the Democratic Party. But let's just remind ourselves of some of the key issues being discussed. So the government of both the United States of America, together with Britain and the EU, are starting to turn on Israel and calling for the IDF to halt their military offensive against Hamas in Gaza. We see that both on the policy agendas of both the Biden administration and the British government are again calling for a two-state solution and the creation of a Palestinian state. And already this has proved to be an absolute failure for over the past 3 decades. Not as only has it endangered Israel's security, but it's also destabilised the Middle East. We see there are intergovernment level discussions taking place on what follows Israel's military defeat of Hamas in Gaza and what comes next. Foreign governments, namely the US, Britain and the EU, are advocating, as I said before, the creation of a Palestinian state. But this time they want the Palestinian Authority to again govern in Gaza and in the Palestinian Authority, which is in Judea and Samaria. And we see that the British government has taken a different position since we've seen the return of our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, to frontline politics and being our Foreign Secretary. It's definitely pushing a two-state solution more, pursuing a globalist agenda, because before this wasn't on the government's radar screen. So we're seeing the calls for a Palestinian state become louder and louder.
And it's one of those problems that we're going to encounter, I think, going further into this conflict. We're going to see more and more calls for such a solution, but it's a solution that's failed. It's a solution that's been presented time and again. And what I've found particularly jarring is the timing of these proposals, the timing of these statements made, as you've said, by Antony Blinken, Grant Shapps, David Cameron, others as well. It is completely tone deaf to what Israel is going through at the moment. Its worst crisis since its foundation, really. It's the worst crisis for the Jewish people.
It's over 75 years. Yeah,
exactly. And so what we're dealing with is this completely tone deaf, blind agenda that says, it's this hand-wringing nonsense that we get up to. What can we do? Let's present a two-state solution. Let's as if this hasn't been talked about, as if Israel has not agreed to a two-state solution on multiple occasions, only for it to be rebuffed since we're talking about going back to 1937. When Britain first proposed a two-state solution.
It was the UN. The UN did that through the UN partition plan of 1947.
But the 37 one would have put the Arabs primarily in control. And they wanted nothing to do with it. Britain has always been in the regard, I mean, we have to be honest about that. Despite the Balfour Declaration, in applying the principles of it, it has always been anti-Jewish state. That might be a controversial thing to say, but I think practically the proof is in the pudding. We've seen increasing, I can just say from a perspective of an American moving to the UK, that was one of the things that was incredibly jarring about both sides of the British political spectrum, that both sides were seemingly and particularly anti-Israel, and were generally, pushing forward a pro-Palestinian agenda. Now, the view that some will take, and I want to clarify that with viewers, not being pro-Palestinian does not mean that you are anti-Palestinian people. That's not at all what we're talking about. We're talking about an ideological agenda that desires the total eradication of Israel and the Jewish people. It's there in the Hamas Charter. It's not just in the Hamas Charter. It is the ideology that's espoused by, promoted, propagated, and perpetuated by almost, without exception, every single main sphere within the Palestinian community and world, whether it's in the political spectrum, whether it's in the legal spectrum, whether it's in the civilian area. There's significant overlap, and that's what's made this conflict very complicated.
No, absolutely. But this is this naive view that if you solve the Israeli so-called Palestinian crisis, or then you bring about peace in the Middle East. And I think the Arab Spring proved that was wrong, because the Foreign Office, and having had high-level meetings with a Syrian opposition leader back in 2004, having a high-level meeting in the Foreign Office, they saw at the time everything through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You create a Palestinian state, there'll be peace in the Middle East, and the whole Middle East is stable and peaceful. But the reality is, the Palestinian leadership have no desire for peace with Israel whatsoever. They see the conflict through as it was 70 years ago, and they want to work for Israel's destruction, because they do not want one single Jewish person to be living in their ancient covenant homeland. So, I mean, effectively, that's the issue. So effectively, they're using the Palestinian Authority as a means to bring a warfare against Israel, whether that's a media war against Israel, whether that's using lawfare, the use of law and international law to weaponize the conflict, to use boycotts, divestments and sanctions to bring about sanctions and disinvestment from Israel, to erode Israel's moral standing in the world, but also to use the conflict now going on Gaza to raise billions, not only for Hamas, but also for the Palestinian Authority as well. And of course, we have to remember and take a biblical viewpoint on this one. So are we witnessing the curse of God upon our nation? As it says in Genesis 12, 1-3, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And is Storm Isha a direct consequence of the British government going against God's foreign policy of attempting to divide God's land and scatter his people and divide Jerusalem? Because there are huge consequences when nations do so. And the amount of programs I've recorded here on Revelation TV over the last decade or more, you literally see a government announcement attacking Israel, and that nation will then be hit by an ecological disaster, or they were literally hit by a massive terrorist attack within a few days of such an announcement. So what we're seeing here is real, and to understand what's going on in our nation, we have to understand this. Well, let's start off with the latest developments, and this was according to the Daily Telegraph, and this is the title of the article: Netanyahu's refusal to back a Palestinian state is very disappointing, said Shapps, and he's our defence secretary. In an interview with Laura Kuenssberg on BBC Breakfast Morning on Sunday, the 21st of January, the Defence Secretary said it was very disappointing that the Israeli Prime Minister continues to reject the creation of a Palestinian state. Grant said it was regrettable to see Benjamin Netanyahu double down on his objections to the proposal, stressing the UK certainly remains wedded to the idea that there isn't another obvious way out of this. Well, there is. It comes after the Israeli leader said he dismissed US President Joe Biden's call for a two-state solution, declaring that he reserves the right to say no to our friends. His remarks appeared to knock back plans to tie a Palestinian statehood to a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia, which would be brokered by the US. His remarks appeared to knock back plans to tie a whole idea of Saudi Arabia and a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia with Israel, if Israel would only recognise a Palestinian state, but I think the Saudis might have something to say about that. We also see that Netanyahu's team went on to say that after Hamas is destroyed, Israel must retain security control over Gaza, a requirement that contradicts the demands for Palestinian sovereignty. And Grant Shapps went on to say as well that Mr. Netanyahu rejects the idea as Palestinians deserving a sovereign state. I think it's very disappointing that Benjamin Netanyahu said that. It's not some sense of surprise. He spent his entire political career against a two-state solution. He told BBC Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg. I mean, to say that there is no other alternative is absolute nonsense. I mean, look at the success of the Abraham Accords. Right. And why were the Abraham Accords so successful is because we saw with the Trump administration that they recognised that the problem of creating peace in the Middle East was the issue to do with the Palestinian reluctance to recognise a Jewish state, to enter negotiations. So they decided, look, and before the only gateway for Arab states to make peace with Israel was to go through the Palestinian leadership.
But even if you were to say that this, is not an ideal or one that we would look for at all, but the very proposal that this is the only way, the only possible way is complete nonsense. You mentioned an ideal, the Abraham Accords in that sense, would be kind of in the middle ground. An ideal would be for all of this to be resolved and for Israel to have its land in full. And I think this is really what Netanyahu and many within Israel desire and want. But such a peace will not come, I don't believe, until the Lord Jesus himself returns.
Yeah, but also when you're dealing with the Middle East, particularly when it comes to the Abraham Accords, and why they were so successful was the fact that the Trump administration completely bypassed the Palestinians and saying, look, if you want to continue your armed struggle against Israel, you want to continue your education system of indoctrinating children to hate Israel, to hate the Jewish people, to glorify and support terrorism and violence against Israel, we're going to cut your funding. So there has to be a price to pay. Yeah. And the problem is not Israel. It's recognizing that the Palestinian leadership is the problem. And therefore, to allow Israel then to create peace treaties with our Arab neighbours, and then that is the only way then to draw the Palestinians into negotiations on the realms that they are completely isolated from the rest of the Arab Sunni world, because they maintain a position of wanting the destruction of Israel, which is an outdated 70-year concept which is not going to happen and has no grounds in reality. So of course we've seen that the Biden administration have totally reversed the entire process of the Abraham Accords, refunded the Palestinian Authority, re-encouraged terrorism against Israel, and of course this is the mess that we're living through today.
Indeed. And yet even if you go back in history, there has been the successful, to a degree successful, almost 20 years successful attempts that stabilized the situation between 1949 and 1967, wherein Israel existed on what was commonly referred to as the West Bank. A significant portion of that was controlled by Jordan, and then what's now Gaza would have been controlled by Egypt. So whatever one supports, whichever alternative view one supports, there are plenty of alternative options. Why continue pushing for something that has provenly failed? Now, of course, that you could call it the three-state option involving Jordan and Egypt failed horribly in the end because at the time Egypt and Jordan, there was infighting between both countries and Israel. There's now peace treaty. However, even that's been upset through this. The issue is, I think this is fair to say, neither Egypt nor Jordan want anything to do with this situation involving the Palestinian people. Why? For the same reason that Lebanon horrifically treats Palestinians in its territory.
And the Syrians,
across
and the Jordanians, and the Iraqis and the Gulf states.
As a problem, it's seen across the board as trouble for Arabs and hindering the progress of the Arab nation states in the world. And so over the years, over the past few decades, we've seen an increasing disillusionment among Arabs, other Arab states with the Palestinian cause. This has not helped that. However, there is at the same time a sense of blood alliance that's there. There's the honor-shame culture that comes in. And so you do have a degree of Egypt saying things against Israel now, once again, Jordan saying things against Israel, once again.
Only because it reflects in their own population.
Exactly.
Because they're afraid of the Arab street. But also, I mean, if Israel, okay, let's see that Israel agreed to the demands of Grant Shapps, our defense secretary, David Cameron, our foreign minister, Biden and President Biden said, okay, yeah, we're gonna create a Palestinian state.
Let's do it.
Tomorrow. What happened? Mohammed Abbas, for example, is almost in his 16th, 17th year as an unelected president of the Palestinian Authority. To be fair, he doesn't have very long in terms of his age and how long he can continue that job. So what happens after Abbas? Is the Palestinian Authority a stable partner to do peace with Israel? No. Because they are corrupt, they are hated by their own people. Yeah. If they opened up and created a Palestinian state, they had free democratic elections, who would take over? Hamas would take over. Israel would then be facing the problem that they're facing in Gaza throughout the entire Palestinian Authority. They would then take control of Judea and Samaria and the hill lands of Israel, and we'd see rockets and missiles fired all over Israel from the hills of Samaria. Mm-hmm. We'd also see that Hamas would then be locked in with Jordan, which would destabilise Jordan and could see the overthrow of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So to say, as Grant Shapps says, and I'll quote this, but the point is, which other route is there to seriously solve this? Palestinians deserve a sovereign state. They don't. Israel deserves to have full ability to defend itself, its own security. In other words, and unless you pursue a two-state solution, I really can't see that there is another solution. I mean, this lacks foresight. I mean, what was interesting about 2008, when Grant Shapps was actually chairman of the Conservative Party, I heard him address something on Iran, and he didn't know what he was talking about. So again, I kind of find that on this issue, despite the fact he has a Jewish background, he does not understand the complexities that Israel is facing, the security dilemmas that are put on the state of Israel, and the danger and the damage a Palestinian state would do to Israel's security, but also to destabilize not only the Middle East, but also the West as well. And calling for a Palestinian state only rewards and encourages more terrorism.
Well, this is not just a problem in the Tory contingent. The Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has reiterated Labour's view, which I dare say is many times worse. In the Labour Party, yes, they've uprooted a lot of anti-Semitism, but there still very much is anti-Semitism deeply embedded in its ethos and philosophy. And she reiterated Labour's view that Mr. Netanyahu's remarks were completely unacceptable, referring back to a speech by her colleague David Lammy on Saturday. What you will have heard David Lammy talk, he was very clear that those words from Netanyahu were completely unacceptable. And she said this in an interview with Trevor Phillips the other day. In David's words, this was morally and practically wrong. Statehood of a people is not in the gift of its neighbor. It is the right of a people, and it is the right of the Palestinian people. Well, this is very short-sighted, and you have to ask on what grounds. I think it's quite right to understand the rules of war generally have remained the same over the years. If you start a war and you're an aggressor, you are an opponent actively seeking the wholesale destruction of a particular people, if that is deeply embedded in your own ethos, politically, culturally, socially, in every single way, through the education system even, with children, as we talked about last summer, Simon, going to terror training camps, if that's part of where you are at, then you have to expect to have a war against you that will see you lose ground. And to be honest, I feel you forfeit your right to whatever claims of statehood you have.
Yeah, but the thing is, though, this is the big irony in all this. The Palestinian leadership themselves do not want a Palestinian state.
No, they want the whole.
They don't want the responsibility that comes with being a statehood. They don't want the responsibility of building an economy that will look after their own people. They don't want to build up an education system that will enhance their people to have better jobs and better quality of life. They don't want to invest in schools. No. And in hospitals and infrastructure. Again, what they want to use is continue this conflict to destroy Israel. So on those grounds where they don't even recognize that Israel has a right to exist, where they honor terrorists within their Palestinian school textbooks, where there are no maps of Israel or recognition of a Jewish state, how can they be responsible in terms of preparing them for statehood? And quite frankly, they don't deserve a Palestinian state because they will just use this to perpetuate the conflict with Israel. They have no intention of making peace with Israel. They've rejected peace with Israel countless times, too many to count. So they, as a people, they're not ready in their current leadership, which is corrupt. And anyone who dares criticize the Palestinian Authority, calls out its corruption, are arrested and never seen again. So maybe we have to look at what kind of civil society is there within the Palestinian Authority before you start giving in demands that they deserve their own state.
Well, here is a perspective from a former pro-Palestinian Iraqi Muslim, Hussein AbdulHussein, who now has extremely pro-Israel perspective and has gone through a real transformation. He says, if Israel disappears tomorrow and the Jews give the keys to the Palestinians, which is what they desire on paper and in word, this is what they desire, from the river to the sea. What do you think will happen next, he asks. You think Palestine will be a country remotely as organized or advanced as Israel? The answer is a resounding no. To imagine free Palestine, look at the Houthis, at Hezbollah, at Iraq. Free Palestine, remember this is an Iraqi Muslim who's writing, free Palestine will be a dumpster ruled by a bloody charlatan and his militia. Women will be forced to cover, almost the case now. Women who engage in sex out of wedlock will be killed for honor crimes. LGBTQ will be killed. Anyone with a different opinion about anything will be beaten, poisoned, or killed. In the summer, Hamas beat and tortured dozens of Gazans who protested poverty and hunger. And then he goes on to just describe the medieval death cult that is evident within Gaza. And he says there's not a single indication that Palestinians ever managed or ever will a semi-decent, quasi-functioning state. The demand for the destruction of Israel and their whining for being everlasting victims is the only thing they can do, and they do it to deflect attention away from their own failure. And then he describes the failures across the Middle East to build healthy, functioning states and how Israel's become the scapegoat for these other nations' failures. But I think this is a very important perspective, and one that we have to continue to present, that this two-state solution has been presented. It's been denied on multiple occasions, not just by Israel, but by the Palestinians themselves. Well, now what we're going to do is we're going to have a news report, and this is from our friends at CBN highlighting Blinken's trip in Israel, calling for Palestinian statehood.
On Tuesday morning, Secretary Blinken met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The secretary on a diplomatic mission, meeting with leaders in the Middle East to discuss the war and the future of the region. Meeting with reporters before his arrival in Israel, Blinken outlined what he says they agree on about Gaza's future after the war. First, that Israel must have peace and security.
Second, that the West Bank and Gaza should be united under Palestinian-led governance. Third, the future of the region needs to be one of integration, not division and not conflict. And fourth, for that to happen, we need to see the establishment of an independent Palestinian state.
However, that's a sticking point for Israel. While the U.S. and others support a Palestinian-led Gaza, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government are against it. While the debate over Gaza's future continues, the growing tension between Israel and Lebanon may direct the course of the war. Blinken and others are trying to de-escalate the low-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah diplomatically. But Benny Gantz, a member of Israel's war cabinet, says time is running out for diplomacy, since nearly 100,000 residents of northern Israel can't return home. Concerns rose on Monday following the assassination of Wissam al-Tawil, the highest-ranking Hezbollah official to be killed since October 7th, and a nephew of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. Also on Monday, Hamas fired the biggest barrage of rockets since the beginning of the year. That as Israel's military campaign continues to uncover Hamas's terror infrastructure. On Monday, the IDF released footage of the largest weapons production site found in the Gaza Strip since the beginning of the war, used to produce long-range missiles capable of reaching northern Israel.
We're now joined by our special guest for this week's Behind the Headlines, Bill Coneg, a former Washington correspondent and author of Eye to Eye. Bill, it's so good that you can join us, even though it's very early in the morning in Texas on Behind the Headlines.
Thanks, Simon. Great to be with you all.
Great to be with you as well. What do you make of this extraordinary story that our Defence Minister, Grant Shapps, in a TV interview on Sunday morning, rebuked the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for rejecting the concept of a Palestinian state? Within 6 or 7 hours later, we were hit by Storm Isha that literally saw 107-mile-an-hour winds that has caused 4 fatalities due to this storm. So share with us this link between announcements of governments when it comes to Israel and then dramatic storms that take place as a direct consequence of a nation cursing God's people and his land.
Well, thanks, Simon. You know, my book, Eye to Eye, which I first wrote in 2004 and then updated in 2017, I study American presidents and notice when we apply pressure on Israel to divide their covenant land or create an Arab state in Judea and Samaria, we have these massive hurricanes, tropical storms, earthquakes, 9/11, at the time or within 24 hours of pressure being applied on Israel by the United States or by the White House to divide their covenant land. So this fits the pattern that you just experienced. And one other thing I might note, during your foreign minister, not foreign minister, it was your tourism director in May of 2011, called on Israel. Actually, they had some, well, I should put it this way, they had information in showing the old city of Jerusalem as being East Jerusalem, the capital of Palestine. And that's when the Iceland volcano exploded and sent ashes all across Europe on the week of the Holocaust memorial period.
So, Bill, do you believe that what we're seeing when we see these catastrophic natural events, that this is to a degree fulfillment of God's covenant promise with Abraham? I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. Elsewhere we see in Joel 3, he speaks specifically condemning those who've divided the land and speaks of judgment being meted out on the nations, specifically on the standard of their seeking to divide the land.
Absolutely. I've watched through 20 plus years of doing this, I've watched the greater the pressure on Israel to divide their covenant land, the greater the corresponding catastrophe. 17 days before the 9/11 terrorism events in the United States, Crown Prince Abdullah and George Bush were working on a comprehensive plan, a two-state plan, the dividing of Jerusalem. They finished their work on 9/10, and then 9/11 happened the next day when 15 of the 19 terrorists were Saudis. Also, after 9,500 Jews were ripped from their homes and their synagogues and their communities in August of 2005, right after, within hours of Bush congratulating Ariel Sharon on his courageous decision, Tropical Storm Katrina developed into a Hurricane Katrina, and to this day, our costliest disaster in U.S. history. Again, the greater the pressure on Israel, the greater the corresponding catastrophe. Most of these have happened in the United States because we have been the promoter of the peace process, but we've also had examples in your country, in France, in Germany, in Russia, when they have been involved with the peace process, or when they've been making comments like was just made there in the UK. There is a consequence, and you can feel the collective fury or the fire of the God of Israel when the idea of creating an Arab state in Judea and Samaria is brought public.
And Bill, can you just explain to us, as a former White House correspondent, why the Biden administration, together with our Foreign Minister David Cameron and that of the EU, plus also some of the Gulf states as well, are now pressurizing Israel to stop its war against Hamas in Gaza, and literally to start to call for the creation of a Palestinian state, when we know that this whole concept of a Palestinian state for the last 3 decades has been nothing but a total and utter failure, because the Palestinian Authority and its leadership don't want a state. They just want the destruction of Israel.
It's absurd, Simon. One of the comments of Joe Biden about 4 or 5 weeks ago, he stated publicly that in order to defuse Hamas and the terrorists, that a Palestinian state would do that. Between Israel and the Palestinians, a Palestinian state would defuse the terrorism. That's absolutely absurd. Iran is the puppeteer. You've got Hamas, Houthi, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah that will never, ever lay down their weapons until they destroy Israel, which we know will never happen biblically. But the bottom line here is there's this absurdity that the international community now is going to apply pressure on Israel to accept a two-state plan because there is a Palestinian fatigue. And the Palestinians are playing the public quite well. They play in the media quite well. A majority of the media, unfortunately, is not pro-Israel throughout the world, including in Europe and also in the United States. And it gets back to it's just absolutely absurd that a Palestinian state will stop the conflict that Israel has with Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi, and Iran.
What solution do you see as viable pending the end of this conflict?
Well, I think Netanyahu has the right idea. They have to do everything they can to eliminate the Hamas problem. That's not easy. We've seen tragically in the last 24 hours, 28 Israeli soldiers died in Gaza. And there is no solution unless there's elimination of Hamas. At the same time, we're watching the situation on the northern border of Israel with great interest. I understand the Russians will be possibly moving some troops to the northern border of Israel and southern border of Syria. So with all that said, there's no solution outside of elimination of the problem.
And Bill, finally, how should our viewers be praying into this situation? And shouldn't our governments, the British government and also the US government in this very important election year, take note that if you touch the apple of God's eye, you yourselves will be touched, with devastating electoral consequences for them, but also incredible damage done to our nations, either through natural storms or through terrorism?
I think what it gets down to, Simon, is just continue to stand for Israel's biblical right to all of the land of Israel. And that the two-state plan is not the solution. The Palestinians have forfeited the opportunity to have a state. And again, that we emphasize the British leaders and also the United States leaders to not apply pressure on Israel to divide their land, at the same time, eliminate the problem that Israel faces, which is Hamas, and not restrict them. The job has to be completed.
So, Bill, we just want to thank you so much for joining us from Texas today. And just a reminder of viewers, you can get Bill's excellent book, which is called Eye to Eye, if you want to know the impact of direct governments making their foreign policies towards Israel and the repercussions of calling for a Palestinian state and cursing Israel in those policy announcements. So thank you so much for joining us today, Bill. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Simon.
According to the Daily Telegraph, it comes as the EU urged member states to impose consequences on Israel if Mr. Netanyahu continues to oppose Palestinian statehood. In a document circulated to EU foreign ministers ahead of a meeting on Monday, Brussels proposed member states set out the consequences they envisage to attach to engagement or non-engagement with their proposed peace plan, the Financial Times reported. This is backed up further by an article in the Times of Israel online under the heading, EU's top diplomat, Palestinian State may need to be imposed on Israel from the outside. The EU Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, said on Friday that the only peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict included the creation of a Palestinian state. And he suggested that this might need to be imposed from the outside without Israel's agreement. But Simon, this is absolutely ludicrous, undemocratic, and
Well, how can the EU do this? I mean, firstly, how can they impose a Palestinian state on Israel unless they're prepared to go to war against Israel? So effectively, that's what he's calling for. But also, this goes against the principles of the Oslo Accords, where the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority are to come up with an agreement themselves. So this also goes against international law. But also, this means that the EU is playing a very dangerous game here, a very, very dangerous game, by saying that Israel is the problem and not the Palestinian Authority. Let's remember who attacked Israel on October the 7th. It was not, Israel did not invade Gaza first, but Hamas carried out the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history, where over 1,400 innocent Israelis were brutally murdered, over 6,000 to 7,000 injured, 240 taken to Gaza, which also then threatened Israel's deterrent capabilities. And that if Israel hadn't launched a ground incursion into Gaza, then effectively this would mean that Hamas would win and that the very state of Israel's very existence would actually be threatened. So we know that Israel is facing an existential threat to destroy Hamas. We see the EU leaders don't actually recognize this, but how effectively do you impose sanctions against Israel, knowing the technological blessing that Israel has been to the EU? And of course, the EU have always wanted to push for the creation of a Palestinian state. But namely, we know that once you have a Palestinian state, this is another means of destroying Israel. We potentially have another Holocaust on our hands, because I think October the 7th showed us exactly what happens when Israel kind of lets her guard down for one moment, because we know the intention of what would happen if Israel created a Palestinian state and Hamas actually took over from the Palestinian Authority, which is very likely in a coup, and Israel is in a bigger war for her very own survival.
Well, Josep Borrell, he continued in this speech at University of Valladolid in Spain, saying that without international intervention, the spiral of hate will continue generation after generation. The actors are too opposed to be able to reach an agreement autonomously, Borrell said. If everyone is in favor of this solution, the international community will have to impose it. But not everyone, first of all, is in favor of this solution. Palestine does not want it. Israel does not want it. Other parties have really essentially no say in it. Also, what Borrell is doing here is he's engaging in, frankly, quite abusive victim blaming, looking at Israel as if they are the instigators of hatred, or as if they are themselves saturated in a spiral of hatred. If you go and you see and you're there, you understand that that is not the case. However, if you do go and you see in both the West Bank and in Gaza, the spiral of hate very definitely is there. I recently asked this question of someone with a placard in Angel, Islington. I managed to capture on film. It was essentially someone who had no clue about the conflict, what it's about. I asked the question, have you ever been? Never been to Israel, the Middle East, or the Palestinian so-called territories. And they said, have you? I said, yeah, about 7 times. Where? Well, I've actually been in that region, multiple spots in the region that they will call the West Bank, right? And I can tell you there's a very different atmosphere in that region from that which is under Israeli predominant control.
But also, I think this is also concerns that we're seeing that this current conflict in Gaza is radicalizing an entire generation of young and impressionable Muslims across Europe, so which feels like they're threatening European security. And the way they think of pacifying this is to put pressure on Israel to create a Palestinian state, which they think will actually diffuse the whole situation. But Israel's on the front line. Israel is literally defending the West, Europe and the United States from this dangerous Islamist ideology that would destroy the West. And effectively you are then, by creating a Palestinian state to live side with Israel, they have no intention of peace. They only believe in what is something in Arabic known as a hudna, which would be a temporary cessation of violence. Until they got stronger, they could then launch a war against Israel. It's exactly what Muhammad did when he took control of Mecca and Medina, and then took control of all the Arab tribes. And they're using this same example here to do with Israel, as we saw this with Arafat in 1994, after just signing in 1993, just after signing the Oslo Accords, gave a speech in a mosque in South Africa. We said that this is a hudna, this is a temporary truce to gain a political and military advantage, and then when we do so, we will attack Israel. And that's exactly what happened, and exactly what this state would actually do. And it would actually do nothing for the Palestinian Arabs themselves, because the corruption within the Palestinian Authority itself.
But Netanyahu has declined any discussion of a two-state solution. He said that no full Palestinian state, no surrender in exchange for Gaza hostages, there in the Times of Israel headline, as he has pushed back on the White House vision of this pathway to a two-state solution, which is itself just purely fantastic in the sense of fantasy. It just is not going to happen. There is no clear pathway to such a solution. Almost any commentator who's observed this conflict for any significant, meaningful length of time is saying the two-state solution is dead in the water. It's not going to be happening. As U.S. President Joe Biden's administration has called for war against Hamas to wind down alongside a pathway toward a two-state solution at the end of the fight. Israel's leadership has presented a vision at odds with that of the White House just this past Sunday. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu doubled down in his video message on his determination not to allow a full-fledged militarized Palestinian state to emerge, saying, "I will not compromise on full Israeli security control over all the territory west of the Jordan River." Echoing recent comments, "As long as I am Prime Minister, I will continue to firmly stand by this." He pledged, boasting that he had withstood international and domestic pressure over the years to move toward a two-state solution. Netanyahu has made similar statements over the past week, though he appears to have been careful not to categorically reject all forms of Palestinian statehood, which should be remembered and recognized. Speaking after a report on Wednesday that said the Biden administration is looking past the premier to advance a two-state solution, and hours after U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said Israel cannot achieve genuine security without a pathway to a Palestinian state, Netanyahu said Israel must maintain security control of all territory west of the Jordan River in any future arrangement.
And of course, the Biden administration are under a lot of domestic pressure. This is a presidential year in 2024. We know that the grassroots support within the Democratic Party is not particularly pro-Israel. And we've seen that with the very few number of congressional or Senate leaders actually willing to address AIPAC, the biggest pro-Israel lobbying organization in the United States. So we know that the longer this war goes on, the more that Democratic voters who support the Palestinian cause will become this I don't know, disenchanted with the Biden administration. It could reflect electorally for him come the elections, but also this could affect America and where America's standing is in the world. If he doesn't back Israel in this war against Hamas, then you guarantee that the war that Israel's fighting against Hamas will come on American soil, British soil and European soil. And that what happens in Israel doesn't stay in Israel. This gets exported around the world. So if the nations of the world allow innocent bloodshed to be shed in Israel, you guarantee that the streets of our major capitals in the Western world will also see the shedding of innocent blood. And this is why it's so serious, because those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. Now, what is so interesting as well is that literally after Grant Shapps, in that interview with Laura Kuenssberg on Sunday, we see that Storm Isha sparked the biggest storms we've seen almost in a generation. So 107 mile an hour storms now, 100 mile an hour storms according to the Daily Mail, that has resulted in 4 casualties. There is a direct spiritual consequence, isn't there, Regan, of when nations come against Israel, they actually then come against the God of Israel.
Well, over the years we've seen, and I do not put motives or assign motives to God for allowing this storm, for orchestrating this storm, but I do know that He is the God of the storm, and He is able to calm the wind and the waves. He is able to send the wind and the waves, and it is an important thing to recognize, even as we were discussing with Bill just a few moments ago, that there very often is a direct correlation between events in the natural world, disruptions in the natural world, and the spiritual health and well-being and actions of a nation. And we have to bear in mind also the words of Jesus when He's asked concerning some individuals who were slain as they were offering sacrifice by Pilate, and others who had a tower fall on them, who had perished, if these were greater sinners than the rest. And he said, it's not about that. Repent, or you too shall likewise perish. So there's the reality that there are immediate consequences, and consequences are evident. We only have to look at the state, even of our churches, Simon, that are riddled with arrogance toward the branches that Paul speaks against in Romans 11, arrogance toward Israel and towards the natural branches from the tree of Israel, right? And that's rooted in the Messiah, okay? We only have to look at the spiritual health of our nation to see that has had consequences. To also recognize that when our politicians and our leaders, our nations, act in a way that is unrighteous or unjust, when they lack moral clarity on this issue, when they bless Israel, they are blessed. When they curse Israel, they are cursed. Lest anyone think it would be any different or we're going to any better place should Trump become president again. The common perspective now, increasingly, is that while Biden is strangely more pro-Israel in this instance, Trump is speaking in ways that seem as if he would want to remove the U.S. involvement completely from not only Ukraine and Russia, but from Israel as well. And I've heard some Jewish perspectives of distrust, believing that he would completely turn his back. So we have to watch through the lens of Scripture.
Absolutely, and also believe that he lost the presidency because he proposed the creation of a Palestinian state. Even though it was favourable to the Israeli government, he still proposed the concept of a two-state solution, and then we saw him lose the elections in November of 2020. What are political leaders, whether it's Grant Shapps, whether it's David Cameron, our foreign minister, or our prime minister Rishi Sunak, or even the US President Joe Biden and his Secretary of State Antony Blinken should take note of this scripture very, very carefully. Because in Joel 3 it says, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is in Jerusalem. There I enter into judgment against them concerning my inheritance, my people Israel. There I enter into judgment against them concerning my inheritance, my people Israel. for they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land. And that's exactly what a Palestinian state would do. We've heard the Palestinian Authority also call that within the Palestinian Authority, which is the very biblical heartland of Israel, known as Judea and Samaria, that it has to be Judean-free. In other words, under the Palestinian Authority, there can't be any Jewish citizens. So the fact is here, we're seeing that the nations are dividing up God's land and they're scattering his people. He brings them for that reason into the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is into Jerusalem, for judgment. And also describes, as the nations have also proposed, dividing Jerusalem between East and West Jerusalem for a future Palestinian state, that the nations coming against the Jerusalem will find themselves coming up against an intoxicating cup of wrath, which is Jerusalem, and they will cut themselves badly. So we know that the nations need to take heed of this, and so do our political leaders, for the sake of peace and security in our own countries and nations.
Well, as we close out, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will enter into judgment against them concerning my inheritance, my people Israel. Why? For they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land. But the promises of God endure. He is bringing Israel home. He is restoring the land. He will give victory to the Jews and bring them to Messiah. God bless you all, and thank you for joining this edition of Behind the Headlines. Continue to pray fervently for the peace of Jerusalem. May you know the blessings upon all those who bless God's people, Israel. Have a good evening. We'll see you, God willing, again next time on Behind the Headlines.